So I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Carolina Albernas, Director of Business Development and Operations at the Brazil-Canada Chamber of Commerce. We're here today with Peter Hawkins, Managing Director of Mellohawk Logistics, and Shannon Blanchard, Cargo Development Manager at Port St. John, to talk about Canada's newest trade connections and opportunities. I would like to pass the mic to Peter Hawkins. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So as you probably know, I was the former vice president of the Brazil-Canada Chamber of Commerce, and I am the managing director of Mellohawk Logistics, and I do sit on the executive committee of the chamber. And the chamber is always trying to take advantage of our wonderful members, and Shannon, representing the Port St. John, is actually a member who is not only very active, but she's very, very active in the trade between Brazil and Canada. So we do have some questions, and so I'm going to, first of all, Shannon, if you could just take a moment and introduce yourself with a little bit of your own background.
Certainly. I'm Shannon Blanchard. I'm the manager of cargo development with Port St. John. I wanted to first and foremost thank Carolina and Peter for hosting today, and for the BCCC for having the platform for the members to be able to give some information to some other folks that could potentially assist in some of your trade with Brazil. So thank you very much. I've been with the port for 15 years, focusing on business development. Just in the last 5 years, really focusing on container development. It is a new sector for us, and we're pleased that because of some of our advantages that we're able to have great connectivities with Brazil.
Wonderful. Shannon, can you describe to us how Port St. John is a new connection for shippers and receivers in dealing with Canada and Brazil? People always think of Toronto, they always think of Montreal. Can you give us a little commentary on Port St. John and its advantages?
Absolutely. So before we get into some of our advantages, I wanted to talk a little bit about who Port St. John is and how we play a role with connectivity into international marketplaces. So we are one of 18 major ports across Canada, and the ports across Canada are actually federally owned ports where we have separate authorities that manage the day-to-day and guidance of the operations for the port on an ongoing basis. So we manage it on behalf of the federal government. Within our CPA system, we are the largest port by volume in Atlantic Canada. So that represents about 24 million metric tons of cargo that flows in and out of the Port of St. John. And from a geography standpoint, for those of you who are unaware, we're located in the southern part of New Brunswick, which is actually about 100 kilometers from the US border. So it puts us nicely not only to connect with our customers within Canada, but because of our geographic position, we also have the ability to diverse our marketplace into the US. As I mentioned, we're a 24 million metric ton facility where we're really lucky because some ports focus primarily on containers, but we have the ability to have diversity in the way that cargo is handled through the Port of St. John. So not only do we handle containers, but we also have the abilities to handle cargoes in bulk form, but also large oversized dimensional pieces in the way of break bulk. So it's great to have that diversity on a revenue standpoint because we're no different than anybody else. Usually you'll see one dip over a period of time and a rise in another sector. So it allows us to maintain our operations in a positive form financially. Now, when you want to talk specifically about Brazil, believe it or not, one of the major commodities historically that has been produced in New Brunswick has been potash, or, and I may butcher it, potassio in Portuguese. Is it right? Maybe?
It is.
Yes, yeah, it is potassio, so that's okay. Yeah.
So we were shipping about 750,000 metric tons of potash from New Brunswick for decades to help in the agricultural sector with Brazil. So we knew that we had an advantage of connecting with Brazil naturally because of some of our natural resources. And upon some further investigation and looking at what our competitiveness as far as distances go, we realized that we're a little bit closer than we actually thought. So, believe it or not, if you look at a map and you look at a globe, you'll see two different perspectives. So, if you're looking at a flat map, you'll see that St. John appears to be further in distance when it comes to other ports like New York. But if you look at an actual globe that has a curve to it and calculate the distance, we're actually equidistant to Santos as New York would be. So, from a shipping line perspective, we can actually get into the marketplaces just as quick as a shipping line that would be working out of a port in New York. So, with that in mind, we realized that we really had more synergies and more work to develop. And over the last, I'd say, 10 years, we've done a significant amount of work in looking at developing and growing the market between, East Coast Canada and Brazil. In particular, looking at what we can do from a container perspective. So there was three things really that we needed to do to develop that, not just from a business development end, but also looking at the complete supply chain. So in 2017, we actually landed a global terminal operator for our container business, which actually has a large significant presence within the South American market. And also they have representation in Brazil themselves. So that terminal operator is DP World. And they came on board. They operate out of 80 ports globally. So they have a strong international presence, which really guides us to enable us to develop some of the new service connectivities that we have. And in doing so, what their job is to look at new services that we can bring into the marketplace for shipping lines to be able to connect shippers across Canada with international marketplaces. So with that, in 2017, just after they actually started their operation here, they landed a new service through the shipping line CMA CGM. And CMA CGM is they fluctuate, but top 5 largest container service offers in the world. So they have a large international presence, but they have excellent connectivity through a service that they've established in St. John called the Kajima service. So this rotation from St. John connects through the US Eastern Seaboard down into a transshipment hub. So I would describe it for anybody in Atlantic Canada looking to get anywhere by plane. We have to go to Toronto or Montreal in order for us to get into any major marketplaces by air. So very much similar in the shipping industry, cargo leaving Canada typically has to go through another port to get to their final destination. So the Kajima service transships in Kingston, Jamaica, and from there goes direct into Brazil. So this is a new connection that we've been, like I said, developing. We've been doing a lot of work in Brazil in particular to build on our business. So looking at building both imports and exports. So that's where this new connection kind of came about. And Peter, you had talked about, what are the advantages? Why would a shipper be interested in looking at the Port of St. John versus some of the more traditional routes through ports like New York or Montreal, for example? So historically, the cargo that's flowing from Canada to Brazil or Brazil to Canada have traditionally used ports in the US to connect, mostly due to transit times. So, how quickly goods can get from one country to another. So, the US ports would receive or the Canadian goods or the Brazilian goods. And keeping in mind that while the transit times have been quite good, depending on what you're shipping, there is a requirement to go through 2 customs. So US Customs would always be involved in it because they would be a receiving port or they would be the port of entry coming from Brazil. So they'd always have to go through a separate set of vigorous customs declarations, certifications, clearances, that kind of thing. But also, if you're looking at foodstuffs, with goods entering into the US, either from Canada or Brazil, destined for Canada, you would also have to have food certification regulations through the FDA as well as the CFIA to be able to bring goods into Canada because the final destination, although it's going through a US port, has to be cleared through CFIA regulations. So because you have two certifications, two regulations, two customs, there's a lot of opportunities for missed time and delays and extra costs if you don't know how to fill out the proper documentation. So we thought that this created an opportunity for us to develop a new connection for Canadian shippers and receivers to get into markets like Brazil a little bit easier without the need of using a US port. So with this, to give you kind of an idea of the advantages, if you're looking at southbound cargo from Canada going into Brazil, if you want to compare the transit times, while I can't give specifics, the differential is within about 5 days, comparing southbound transit times from St. John compared to New York. And the ports in Brazil that would be comparable with for the southbound would be Fortaleza, Itajaí, Manaus, Paranagua, Salvador, Santos, Victoria. So we do have a lot of options throughout Brazil. And when you want to look at northbound cargo, we're looking at less than 30 days, which I believe in New York, it's just over 20. But the ports that were very competitive would be Itajaí, Paranagua, Salvador, Rio, and Santos. So there's optionality for both northbound and southbound cargo, depending if you're interested in imports or exports. Now, as I talked about, having the terminal operator, you also have the shipping line, and we needed to look at how are we going to connect beyond Atlantic Canada. So we were able to establish very competitive connections with CN Rail to allow for goods to move through, the Atlantic Canadian provinces into central Canada very competitively, looking at some of the alternative ports in our region. So to give you an example, the ship arrives with CMA on a Friday. It's cleared through customs, and then goods are released, brought into Montreal on Monday, and then Tuesday for Toronto. So you're only having a 3 or 4 day window between ship's arrival and cargo landing in final destination Toronto. Also, some other things that are really interesting depending on where the shipper or receiver is located. The best example I can give would be I was at a port, a large major port in Asia. And when I went to do the port tour, there was a long lineup of trucks with a bunch of containers waiting to get in. And you wouldn't believe it, but the lineup to get into a major port can be up to 20 kilometers long. It's amazing when you see how much delay the container can have while it's trying to enter through the marshalling area into the actual container terminal. So our container terminal is located adjacent to the highway system. So there's no congestion. Trucks can come in quite easily. And the other good thing is that there's no requirement for a truck to go through the city center. It goes completely off the highway right into the terminal. So it allows for a lot of quick and ease of clearing those trucks. The other thing that is an advantage for St. John and looking at having operations and utilizing our services is that DP World actually offers a lot of value-added services for shippers and receivers. So you have optionality as far as how you want to get your goods. Specifically, like if you're in Central Canada, you don't have to take a container into your actual place of manufacturing or operation and have it stuffed there. You can actually rail it or truck it into the DP World Terminal, have it warehoused in one of their 4 warehouse options. They have about 500,000 square feet of space, and they can actually take your goods that are in storage, have just in time to your customer, stuff the container, and ship it out directly from there. So it's a big advantage having that offering for cross stocking or stuffing or de-stuffing of containers for the customer. In addition to that, the Port of St. John also has a 100,000 square foot warehouse or manufacturing facility on the pier that is available for lease. So it could be a partial lease of 100,000 or the 120,000 square feet, or it could be a full utilization of the facility. But if you have a large requirement for marine activity, you could actually move your entire operation on port property where you can do your stuffing and de-stuffing of containers and avoid the inland to get it into the port because it's located right on port property. Some other advantages are St. John is New Brunswick's only foreign trade zone point. So the federal government actually awarded us the ability to have access to programming for importers that are looking to bring goods in and holding them in a bonded warehouse for up to 4 years without incurring any duties and taxes until goods are further exported into international markets. So it's good from a cash flow perspective if you're looking at accessing other markets. So if you're an importer from Brazil and you wanted to get closer to US customers, you could actually warehouse your goods in Canada, not pay any duties or taxes until they're further re exported. Or you can actually bring goods in that are part of raw materials in the manufacturing of another product, then you can actually have a tax exemption from the duties and taxes that are implied by the federal government because you're hiring local labor to take a product and manipulate it into something else. So they're generating economic stimulus through the labor instead of the taxes that you would have paid. So it's a program that we're really excited about, and we partnered with the federal government as well as the provincial government and our local economic development agency to ensure that it exists. My final point, I guess, of an advantage would be that where we're located, we actually don't have any impediments to the harsh winters in Canada as far as the ice in the harbor goes. We actually have an ice-free harbor. So ships can come and go quite freely. We have a labor force who have worked in the port in the conditions in the winter for several decades. And actually, years ago, just a little piece of history, when the St. Lawrence used to freeze and there was no access into the Montreal port, St. John would actually receive a lot of people from Montreal port to work here in the winter. And St. John was actually deemed as called the winter port for the ports in Montreal. So that's just a little history for you from that perspective. Um, Final advantage is that we like to call ourselves a facilitator of trade. So we're not just a port authority, but we really are engaged with our shippers and receivers. And we've done a lot of work where we can match shippers and receivers in 2 different countries and bring them together to do business. So we have a lot of connectivities, not just with Brazil, but through countries across Central South America and the Caribbean that we also have great synergies with. And we've aligned ourselves with different associations and different industry groups that will allow for people in Canada to develop and foster their growth within that particular country. So I know that sounds like a long-winded question, but that was 2 in 1.
No, it's funny, Shannon. I want to underline four things that you said. First of all, the facilitating trade, that is gold for us. What I have found in my experience with my company using Port St. John is that you folks have been willing to go to Brazil, make sure you make the contacts, and continue to make the contacts. And so I think that's something that we have to really stress, is that you as the Port Authority are totally willing to fly down and make sure that the people in St. John, or the people in Brazil, understand that you are an option. I also want to stress about congestion, especially congestion in New Jersey. It's not just the trucks arriving in too, it's also just congestion at the port generally, with so many ships coming in and a backlog of containers and a backlog of container inspections, because you got to remember, US inspection can be ruthless. If they pull it, you're going to pay for it. That's all there is to it. You don't have any recourse, and you really don't have any recourse. I do want to underline one other thing. St. John, New Brunswick, a nice free port, is not St. John's, Newfoundland. And people do make a distinction, or make a confusion there. So I want to stress that it's Port Saint, Saint, John, John, in NB, in New Brunswick. That is the port we're talking about. And finally, one other thing I want to stress too is delays. If you are pulled aside in New Jersey, and then you're brought across and have to be investigated again, and then finally and you're held in Port St. John before you're reshipped back to the US, you could risk multiple opportunities for delay, and delay always means costs. And so one thing I really like about the Port St. John is that your willingness to address any kind of delays as quickly as possible, but also to minimize them. You have all kinds of areas that are just not available to be a risk. But there are some disadvantages. And so can you share us a little bit with some of the concerns and some ways you have mitigated some of the issues that you might have had at Port St. John?
Yeah, and just before I touch on that, I wanted to say that we always say that our shippers and receivers are big fish in a little pond at Port St. John. Whereas if you look at some of the larger ports, you're a small fish in a big pond. So you definitely do get your time and ear when you're working with folks here at the Port of St. John. So yes, that's very much true. Now for challenges, we're not unlike any other port, and we're not unlike any other country for that matter. And along with looking at setting up new services, come along some challenges with the implementation of the service connectivities. And with this new addition of our container services with CMA, a lot of what we were looking to accomplish was to look at developing our import strategy. And with the import strategy that we had, came along with an increase in the number of customs inspections. So, because imports are typically targeted as a new shipper would come into the port, we saw that we had a higher than average rate of inspection at the beginning of the service. However, with the mitigation of working with CBSA, as well as reducing the amount of cost and time delays for shippers, we've actually brought all of our inspections on port property, so that they don't actually have to leave the terminal in order for the CBSA agent to inspect them. We also have technologies like X-rays that can actually do a full scan of the full container, or also do scans of pallets. So it does reduce a lot of time and cost if you're implied to have an inspection done by CBSA. Unfortunately, we can't dictate to CBSA which containers are and aren't. That's up to their discretion.
But you have gone to bat for us, and I really appreciate that. And I think that's something that no other port has ever done for us. In the interest of time, I want to speed through a couple of things, but one of the things I think would be curious to know is just where are you having success in trade between Canada and Brazil, and perhaps talking to us about some of the products that you're seeing going both ways.
Yeah, certainly. So from a Canadian perspective, we're seeing like a export volume of $2.1 billion out of Canada. So you're looking at newsprint, peat moss, scrap metals, fertilizers, machinery, pharmaceutical products, chemicals, rubber products, food stuff, including seafood, feeds, and parts for vehicles. Now, on the export side or the import side, we're seeing about $5.51 billion coming into Canada from Brazil. That includes, the typical sugar, the coffee, the foodstuffs, pet coke, clays and metals and wood pulp and tissue product, tires, pharmaceuticals, wood products, uh, eucalyptus products. So there's a wide variety of different types of products that we're seeing coming through the port. And one thing I have to note is that with the work we've been doing with Brazil, that on our import side is actually representing the largest import market year to date.
Oh, nice. So I didn't realize that. Congratulations. So I'm also okay. So year to date, but what about the future? What does the future look like for you? And yeah, so what are the plans?
Yeah. So because of the growth that we have within our container business, we see the need that it's not just growing our service connectivities, but also looking at the infrastructure. So we're actually putting up $205 million in infrastructure enhancements over the next 3 to 4 years so that we're able to build our capacities, not just from a container end, but also from our rail connectivity side. So we'll be able to offer further growth in diversification of connectivities, but also for our existing services that we have today, and also to support the growth in our number of customers that we can handle efficiently and effectively.
And then I guess finally, so shippers and importers, who should they call? Like, how do they facilitate getting their own stuff moving?
Yeah, so depending on where the company is as far as their business development plans and their readiness for export, each province does have an economic export agency that can help building their export program. But if you're a little bit closer and ready to ship and you're looking for pricing, if you're looking at connectivity into Brazil, you could certainly reach out to CMA, CGM directly if you have the expertise and knowledge within your organization to be able to build out the full cost of getting goods into those markets, and you have the expertise and knowledge on the proper documentations and clearances that need to be made for your goods. But if it's a case where you don't have that internal understanding and know-how, I would highly recommend that you reach out to a forwarder who has that expertise and knowledge. And just going to throw it out there, but Mellohawk does a lot of work with Brazil. And they do a great job.
Yeah, I would highly recommend them too.
One option, but highly recommended option. They can provide all-in rates for your inland, your freight to get to Brazil, or vice versa, and take care of all of the proper documentation requirements needed. If you're looking at building your business in Brazil, or for any country for that matter, Global Affairs Canada actually has a trade commissioner service as well that are located within the countries that can actually help facilitate discussions with other interested parties that are looking at buying some of the goods. And they actually have trade commissioners not only located throughout the country, but also that have the expertise and knowledge in certain sectors. So if you're dealing with mining or agriculture, there's separate people to deal with all of those different segments of business.
Fantastic. And the Trade Commissioner Service, of course, is the famous secret weapon, but because it's free,
Yeah.
you can take advantage of them. Your tax dollars have already paid for it. We've got to take advantage
Mm-hmm.
of them. Absolutely. Shannon, that's been terrific. And one thing I think we should underline too that you just pointed out is the service doesn't stop at St. John. You are a component of getting to market, whether it's going to be to the US or to Central Canada and beyond. And so I think that's very important to stress too, is that your flexibility and your ability to make all of that happen really is important and valuable. Yep. Should we look see if we have some questions?
Yeah, so I'd like to see if anyone has any questions specifically to Shannon or Peter, you can type into the little text box. I actually have a question. So you mentioned that you guys been dealing with Brazil for a long time, and you've been a big facilitator of trade. So can you provide a little bit more details on activities that Port St. John has done with Brazil in the past years to increase trade between both countries?
Shannon, before you answer that, I just want to point out, I'm from New Brunswick. You're in New Brunswick, and I have seen you way more in Brazil than New Brunswick. I think the last 4 times have been in Brazil.
I know. Yeah, so that's a very good question, because when we target our markets, we really try to do the best job we can at, like I said, building on our imports and exports. And in order to do so, you have to be in market that you're trying to develop. So like Peter said, I've spent a lot of time in Brazil over the last couple of years. So within a 12-month period, I think I was there about 4 times. So people were actually wondering if I was positioned there. But through some connectivities, we also contracted some in-market representation to act on our behalf. We also set up very key relations with the trade commissioners, the embassies in Brazil, the consulates, to act on our behalf when we're not there, so that they can answer some of the questions, or at least put companies in contact with us if they have any questions. They know who to reach out to. We also engaged, the association BCCC here in Toronto, where we were able to participate in some industry events that put us in contact with shippers and receivers to be able to promote with large audience groups the service connectivities between the 2 countries. And we did the same thing in Brazil, matching ourselves up with other associations that allowed us to speak specifically to different industries that we knew were a traditional industry shipping to and from Canada. And with that, all in all, we also did a lot of research in trying to identify key shippers and receivers that we can engage to build up that customer base. So it's been a long process, but we've been very active in promoting and doing things like this, webinars. I've done webinars in Brazil as well. So it really does play nicely to seeing that largest import market being Brazil, having put so much time and effort into building that piece.
We do have a question from Fernanda. Fernanda, is there a minimum of products or price to use the St. John port? So I guess LTL shipments, is that a possibility?
So unfortunately, with the Kajima service with CMA, they only offer full container load service options. So that would mean that the smallest shipment that you could take advantage of would be a 20-foot container.
Can you work with freight forwarders actually to facilitate LCL shipments?
Only if we can do a consolidation into one container, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So since the minimum load would be a 20-footer, which we could combine shipments and have different waybills.
That's the service a freight forwarder would offer.
Exactly. So if you have something less than a full container load, you'd have to talk to a consolidator of some kind, like a freight forwarder. Sorry, jumped in on there.
Okay, you were a freight forwarder. So is this a service Mellohawk would offer?
Absolutely.
Okay, there we go. Thank you so much. So we're kind of short on time. So I would like to thank Shannon. Peter, do you have any final comments?
No, but I just, one thing I think people should remember is that, I don't have any comments, and here's my comment. I think people should understand too that sometimes you can't dictate the port, but this is a really valuable port that you should really start to look at which shipping lines are frequenting St. John Port, because you avoid congestion, you have a chance to actually save some money, and you're not risking any more in time. And those 3 factors are the most important things that any shipper is concerned about. So I really think it's less a case of considering which port you use and more of which shipping line you use to make sure that they are actually taking advantage of the opportunities at St. John Port. I really want to underline that. So people say, oh, I can't make that decision and all that stuff. You absolutely can. It depends on what shipping line you use.
And Shannon, any final comments?
No, I think that's it for now. I will share my email address should there be any specific questions. Okay. I can also be found on our website at sjport.com. And I'd be happy to answer any further questions or put you in contact with anyone that would be appropriate to answer them for you.
And people should really take advantage of that resource, because it's not often a Port Authority is willing just to take anybody's inquiry and find an answer, and also to push them toward the people who could help them with their problem. So Shannon, thanks so much for that.
No problem.
So we will have this webinar available on our website in a few days, also with the contact information for both Shannon and Peter, as well as a brief presentation of the services offered by Port St. John and Mellohawk Logistics. I would like to thank you all for participating here today. If you have any questions also on how the Brazil-Canada Chamber of Commerce can support your business moving to Brazil or doing business in Brazil, we're here to help. Our contact information is also on our website. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our annual sponsors, Vale, Brookfield, and Votorantim Samari Cement for their support, and Mellohawk and Port St. John today for all this amazing content. Thank you so much, and please keep in touch with us and keep engaging. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Peter. Thank you.